All right, welcome back to the Dionysus Circle podcast. Today, I present a conversation with Swiss philosopher Damiano Costa. We discuss his recent work on the Aristotelian theory of universals, focusing on two arguments he's developed against the view. One central theme of the discussion is Costa's objection to the attempt to ground the existence of universals, so things like redness, chairness, what have you, in exemplifiers, in things that exemplify red, such as a red stop sign, or things that exemplify chair, such as the chair that I'm sitting on now. His thought is something like exemplification. That's a kind of relation. Relations presuppose generally the existence of the relata, which in this case would include the universal itself. Anyway, you'll hear the full argument developed in the episode. You should know Costa has published in leading venues, philosophy, the Journal of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. And of course, I would especially recommend his 2021 article, An Argument Against Aristotelian Universals. You can easily check it out online. And I began the conversation just by asking Damiano, a little bit about himself, about his background.
So I usually define myself a Swiss philosopher. So I'm a philosopher from Switzerland. I work mainly in metaphysics, a little bit also in the philosophy of physics. I have also a side interest in medieval philosophy. I did my PhD between Geneva in Columbia University, and I am now a professor in Lugano. And when it comes to how I got into philosophy, it's a typical story. So when I was a small child, I always enjoyed asking myself, wondering about the big questions of existence, like, the structure of reality, the nature of the mind, the freedom of the will. Also, growing up in a Catholic family, these questions often took the form of of a theological nature. So I was wondering about, for example, the compatibility of freedom and divine foreknowledge or things like this. And of course, I didn't know that there was a discipline that was dealing with such questions. And then finally, I was able to give a name to my passion and to make a living out of it as well.
Today we're going to talk, like I said, about your article, An Argument Against Aristotelian Universals. And I thought maybe we could kind of just set the stage by talking about a couple things. Maybe what is an Aristotelian universal? Second, the basic reason you reject them. Because basically, to anticipate, we're going to talk about a couple arguments that you've given against the existence of Aristotelian universals. And then we'll also, in this brief introduction, just talk a little bit about what theory of universals you would prefer. So let's just start with the first point. How would you describe, what is the Aristotelian view of universals?
As far as the term is used, at least in contemporary metaphysics, which is somehow loosely related to the historical view held by Aristotle, but not necessarily so. As much as or in the context of contemporary metaphysics, I would say that an Aristotelian view of universal is, first of all, a form of realism, according to which, therefore, universals exist. Not only this, but probably it's a view that somehow is committed to the extramental existence of universals. So it's not a form of nominalism or conceptualism. It's really a view according to which universals exist. But it's a particular form of realism, according to which universals exist, but do not so independently of particulars. So universals exist in a sense to be specified, exist in the particulars that exemplify or instantiate or have them. So in a sense, it's a view according to which universals live or exist among us, so in particulars, so they depend on them. So it's a form of realism, once again, but according to which universals are somehow anchored to concrete reality.
Great, that's helpful. So first off, like you said, just to echo, an Aristotelian theory of universals is a realist theory, and it's not the only realist theory. So, another realist theory would be, a Platonic theory, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so, I guess the disagreement is like, how do these universals exist among different realist? Sorry, the disagreement among different realist conceptions of universals would be, how do they exist? And I suppose maybe right now we should just mention very briefly, roughly speaking, what a universal is before we go further. Just roughly speaking, redness would be a universal. It's shared by many. It's common to many entities. All the stop signs, they're sharing redness. Anyway, do you want to say anything just really briefly on that, like just so the listeners understand what a
No, I think you're right, basically. So a universal is something that is shared by many things. That might be, for example, particulars, just like you mentioned. There might be several apples that are all red. Redness, the universal redness, is what they share, what they have in common. If there is such a thing, of course. But yes, these are what universals are supposed to be. Yeah. When it comes to the question of what a universal is, maybe, I'm sure you're going to have a chance later during this conversation to say more things about this. But I think that there is a tendency nowadays to think of universals as attributes, as things that are head or characterize other things. So they might be, for example, universal properties or universal relations that in principle can be had or possessed by things or shared by several things. And I think that this characterization of universals as attributes plays a role in the discussion that we're going to have. But I think this is enough to have an idea of a universal, what a universal is supposed to be.
Roughly speaking, what would you say is your basic reason for rejecting an Aristotelian view of universals?
Yeah, maybe I should start answering this question by saying that, at least at the beginning, I really wanted to be an Aristotelian. So the Aristotelian view of universals had kind of an appeal on me. I thought that it was intuitive to believe in such a thing as a universal, but to see it as anchored in reality, as I was saying before, but then trying to understand the view, trying to have a better sense of what it was really saying, I kind of stumbled upon a problem that I take to be a serious problem. So again, I think we are going to discuss about this, but in a nutshell, the problem is that I take the definition of the view to be one that entails that universals, Aristotelian universals in particular, somehow bring themselves about. And they contribute to make themselves exist. And I think that this is something that is problematic, is somehow contrary to other thoughts with the very nature of dependence, of this relation of bringing about that structures reality, according to an Aristotelian view of reality itself.
Right. So it's like, if something is going to come to exist, generally speaking, it sounds very problematic to say that the thing brought that about its own coming into existence. That seems like that can't be the case. And so, yeah, if the Aristotelian view leads to that situation where you have to say somehow the universal is bringing itself into existence, that's going to be really problematic. But yeah, we'll see how the details and see how that fleshes out.
Yeah, at this very general level, you might see the problem as a problem that is being discussed several times throughout the history of philosophy. You might be familiar, and our listeners might be familiar with the phrase causa sui, cause of itself, right? And you might think that there is something problematic with the idea that something can cause itself into existence. And maybe the only way of making sense of this is to reject the letter of the motto causa sui and believe that when someone says that something is causa sui, is cause of itself, what is really said there is that the thing itself has no cause, right? And so in general, it's impossible for something to bring itself about.
Right, because if it brings itself about, if it's brought into being, it seems like it has a cause, and generally speaking, it seems like it's going to be kind of absurd to say that something brought itself into being, because it would have to. It seems like it would have to exist prior to existing. Otherwise, how
Yeah.
could it have brought itself into being? Anyway, okay, cool. Yeah, we'll go into more details here. Okay, so yeah, just real quick, again, just kind of setting the stage here. Is there a view of universals that you would prefer over the Aristotelian view?
Yeah. So one could take an argument against the Aristotelian view to be also an argument in favor of nominalism, so in favor of rejecting the existence of universals.
Right.
I myself, even after this argument, remain persuaded by the classical arguments for realism. So I take the existence of universals to be independently plausible, and I see the force of even the simplest arguments, such as the argument from resemblance, the idea that universals are needed to explain or are the more straightforward explanation for resemblance in the concrete world, or in general resemblance, I would say. And also, I'm persuaded also by the failure of various forms of nominalism. So if your listeners are interested, the classical reference in contemporary metaphysics are the books of David Armstrong. All these, despite several serious replies that these arguments I've received, and here I would suggest, for example, the works of Gonzalo Rodriguez Pereira, who have done serious work on this in favor of nominalism. But still, I'm still persuaded by these arguments in favor of the existence of universals. So I would rather lean towards a different form of realism. So one in which basically universals exist, but do not owe their existence to the particulars that have them. So they have a sort of independent existence. This does not mean, I should also point out, that the order of explanation has to be reversed somehow. So saying that universals are independent from particulars does not yet mean that particulars depend on universals. This would be something further to be said. I'm not actually ready to to claim anything in this direction. So I would lean towards a form of Platonism, according to which universals exist and are simply independent from particulars.
Cool. Okay, so that's maybe enough for like kind of a general introduction. And maybe we can kind of just flag for the listeners that, we're going to look at kind of two arguments that you've developed against the Aristotelian theory of universals. And one of them kind of has to do with exemplification. And then the second argument has a little bit more to do with states of affairs and how states of affairs are constructed. And so we're going to get to those two arguments soon, and that's kind of going to be our main focus. But my thought is maybe, first we just dig a little bit deeper into the Aristotelian view, make sure that we understand what it's saying. And we can kind of move more quickly through this because we've already been touching on it, so I don't want to be too redundant. But maybe reemphasize again that the Aristotelian view is one version of realism. The other version of realism is Platonism. Is there anything you want to comment on in that domain? Any further detail you think you want to give on that?
Yeah, I think there are many things to be said, because just like the Aristotelian view of universals is much richer than a simple view about the dependence of universals on particulars. Also, the contemporary views that go under this name, the Aristotelian view, are indeed richer. They are views not only about the dependence of universals on particulars, but sometimes when talking about the Aristotelian view, people also are considering other aspects of universals and their existence. So some people talk of the Aristotelian view as a view according to which that not only has to do with the dependence of universals on particulars, but also has to do with, say, for example, the location of universals. So the question there would be whether a universal is located in space-time or rather is not, and whether this entails that it is located somewhere else or nowhere at all. So all this to say that under this label, the Aristotelian view, maybe several different aspects of the nature of a universal, or several different questions that one might ask about this nature of the universes go. So But my arguments are really focused on the Aristotelian view as a view about the dependence of universals on particulars.
Okay, that's helpful. So so there's different kind of questions that you can ask with respect to universals. Some of them have to do with like the source of their being, and do they depend, for example, on being exemplified? Does redness depend on red things to exist? But then I guess there's other kind of related questions like, suppose redness exists, maybe it's because of red things exemplifying them. Does redness exist in space and time? Is it or does it exist out of it? So is that would be kind of like a location question? Is that what you're...
Yeah, correct. And I think that one might have a sense of these different questions when one appreciates that the very way in which we have introduced the Aristotelian view, the general motto according to which universals exist in particulars, is actually ambiguous. What is it to exist in? So existing in might refer to, again, the spatial-temporal location of the universal, but it might also refer to other things. One might think that existing in is simply a way of talking about the fact that something cannot exist without the particulars, and so it really has to do with dependence. But it might even refer to other things. So one might think that, for example, for a universal to exist in something else is actually a way of being. So in the direction of ontological pluralism, right? The idea that there are many ways of being. And there is a specific way of being that is the way of being of universals. So you see, even when you start from this very simple, very classical characterization of the Aristotelian view according to which universals exist in particulars, and you appreciate the ambiguity of this expression, you see that under the label Aristotelianism, many views actually could cover themselves and have to be uncovered by us philosophers.
That's helpful. Yeah. One thing I was kind of thinking about, I don't know if this is quite apropos what you just said, but I was wondering myself, dependency, that seems like a word or a term that you might define in different ways. And I was kind of wondering to myself, when it comes to the Aristotelian theory of universals, the idea that maybe universals depend for their existence on their exemplification, that would be a type of ontological dependency in the sense of the existence, the fact that the universal is a being is depending on exemplification. Whereas, there's other types of dependency. Maybe it's like one thing might depend on something else in terms of, I don't know, like its explanation, or maybe in terms of its definition, or, well, I guess what I'm thinking is like, it seems to me in the Aristotelian context, they talk about different types of priority. So it's like maybe exemplification is prior to the universal in terms of like ontological priority. And then maybe there's other types of priority, like there's something can be prior in time or something can be prior in explanation. So I guess that might be a relevant thing to think about at some point when it comes to the Aristotelian view, like what exactly is meant by dependency.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to understand the Aristotelian view to understand what we mean by dependence here. In that, I'm really a contemporary metaphysician in the sense that the topic of dependence in metaphysics in particular is quite popular nowadays. It can be seen as a part of the contemporary Aristotelian revival in nowadays metaphysics. So more and more metaphysicians talk about hylomorphism or essence or indeed dependence. So it can be seen as part of this. And really, you're right in saying that the topic of dependence or priority is itself ambiguous. When we talk about priority, we might mean indeed a priority in time, priority in some kind of order. Here we are really talking about a sort of objective, mind-independent, non-temporal order. And the idea is that really reality itself, which might be composed by entities of different categories, is structured hierarchically, and some entities are more fundamental, are prior, are more basic than the others. So to make a classical reference, well, of course, Plato believed that universals or forms are more fundamental in this sense, whereas Aristotle believed that concrete substances are more fundamental in this sense. So this is the general topic, which I take to be one of the classical topics of philosophy. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my answer, I'm really a contemporary metaphysician. So nowadays we talk about this kind of ontological dependence in, maybe I should say just a couple of words about how nowadays. So until recently, metaphysicians tended to make sense of this notion in model terms, so in terms of necessity, right? Where we could have said something like X depends on Y, if and only if the existence of X necessarily implies the existence of Y, right? So I don't know, for example, you might think that the whiteness of this piece of paper, intended as the whiteness of this very piece of paper, depends on this piece of paper because its existence entails the existence of the piece of paper, right? Necessarily so. So this was one way, one classical way of making sense of dependence in terms of necessary entailment of the existence of one thing of the other. But more recently, I think that people have realized that we can find easy counterexamples here. So, for example, if you believe that there are entities that exist necessarily, well, somehow their existence is entailed by the existence of any other thing. And this would create weird cases of dependence. So, for example, it would depend on number 4 if number 4 necessarily exists, which is a weird thing to say. It doesn't seem to be capturing really the idea of dependence that we wanted to capture in the first place. Also, when we talk simply about dependence, an entity depending on another, there is something that perhaps we are missing. Maybe you are saying something that was going that direction before. So when we say that X depends on Y, we are not really specifying the aspect that is dependent and the aspect that is responsible somehow for the aspect that is dependent. So take a classical example. You might think that wholes depend on the parts, right? But you might wonder what precisely of the parts is responsible for the whole. Maybe the existence of the parts, or maybe the arrangement of the parts. In what of the whole depends on the parts? The existence of the whole, or maybe the nature of the whole? So it seems that this talk of dependence as a two-place relation, X depends on Y, does not allow you to specify these aspects of dependence. In maybe for these reasons, so the failure of the modal approach and the need of specifying the aspects, nowadays we rather talk of dependence in terms of specific technical notion, which is the notion of metaphysical grounding, which can be seen at least introductorily, as a relation among facts. So, for example, the fact that, say, the table exists is grounded in the arrangement of the parts, the fact that the parts are arranged in a given way. So you have this relation that relates to facts and is supposed to capture this dependency in non-modal terms, allows you to specify the aspect of dependence.
Okay, yeah. So when it comes to metaphysical grounding, you just gave an example. Okay, so if you arrange a certain set of physical items in a certain way, you will thereby generate or have in your hands a chair, and so intuitively you want to say that the chair is sort of grounded in this particular arrangement of physical things. And do we want to include the necessity idea? I mean, you were talking about the modal issue related to dependency just a second ago, but do we want to say that if one thing grounds another, it necessitates that other thing? Like,
Yeah. So the question of the relation between metaphysical grounding and necessity is one that is much discussed. In the principle that you have just mentioned goes under the name of grounding necessitarianism. And it's not obvious. I mean, it sounds intuitive, right? Once you have the basis, you should somehow automatically also have what is grounded, right? But here again, as you might expect, philosophers came up with some counterexamples. And there is an easy one that involves indeed things in their parts. So the question is whether once you have the parts in the correct arrangement, you necessarily also have the whole, right? Or not? That's the question. At first, you might think yes, but it's not obvious. Because suppose that you have a table and then you disassemble it. And then for, say, a century or a millennium, you just have the parts without having the table. And then you rearrange them and you get a table. But is it the same table as before? It's not obvious, right? And if it is not the same table, then grounding necessitarianism is false because you have the base, you have the ground, without having what is grounded, namely the existence of that table. So it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a topic that is much discussed, the relationship between grounding and necessity, but it's not obvious what we should think about this. Yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, because I was trying to think of like more, like. I'm trying to think. Like, I guess I was thinking, there's other, you might casually use the word grounding where it doesn't necessitate the existence of that thing. Like someone might casually say that, my existence is grounded in my parents, but of course my parents, existing does not, entail necessarily my existing.
Yeah. And maybe I should also point out that the example of the parents maybe is more a case of causal dependence. So somehow the parents are involved in causing my existence. But the kind of dependence that we are talking about, metaphysical grounding, is not really the same as causality, right? So usually we think of causes as preceding in time the effects, not only in the causal order, but also in time. Whereas when it comes to metaphysical dependence or metaphysical grounding, usually there is a synchronicity, right? Or there might be also cases of metaphysical grounding of entities that are completely outside time. So these are some reasons to believe that really metaphysical grounding is something different from causality.
Right. Yeah. So what about like, and I'm just trying to get another example on the table for people. What about like two people signed a contract to make a corporation, and it seems like it seems like you might want to say, oh, the signing of the contract among those people grounded the existence of a corporation, but I guess that would fail the necessity point, which maybe is not a problem, but it would at least fail the necessity point because it's like you can sign a contract, but if there's not a bunch of social institutions at work, that won't thereby generate a corporation.
So here is another example of grounding that might somehow be illuminating to your listeners. So if you're familiar once again with classical Aristotelian metaphysics, so you might think about the category of individual accidents, like my being seated right now. Well, accidents are supposed to be things or entities that are by their very nature dependent on the substances that have them. So if you believe in this kind of Aristotelian idea, then you have another example of grounding probably there, right? So somehow the existence of those individual accidents is grounded in something pertaining or concerning the substances. And in general, when you ask, when you wonder about what is fundamental in reality, what are the basic building blocks in your metaphysics, you are wondering about a question that can probably be stated in terms of grounding.
And then, yeah, to bring it back to the kind of the question of the hour, the whole issue of the Aristotelian view of universals. So, one seemingly plausible characterization of the Aristotelian view of universals is that the universals depend on exemplification. So, and I guess maybe we could describe that in terms of grounding. We might want to say that the existence of universals is grounded in their being exemplified. So the existence of red is grounded in there being red things that have the attribute. There being things that have the attribute of being red. And so, anyway, that's like, I suppose that's the relevance of talking about grounding right now, is that, that's one way of characterizing the Aristotelian view.
Correct. So the idea, remember, the general idea is that according to the Aristotelian view, universals depend on particulars. But once you decide to express dependence in terms of grounding, the question is really how should you express this idea of dependence, right? And so you have to identify a relevant aspect pertaining to universals, and probably it is their existence, which is supposed to be grounded in something, in effect, involving the particulars, right? And what would that fact be? Well, not the simple existence of the particulars. The particulars might exist without the universal existing, according to the Aristotelian view. So it is rather the fact that particulars exemplify or have or instantiate the universal. But it's not like it is a specific particular exemplifying the universal that grounds the existence of the universal. It is any particular, no? So the simple fact that the universal is exemplified or instantiated is going to be the ground of the existence of the universal.
Yeah, the fact that some particular or other is exemplifying redness is the ground, I suppose, of redness in the Aristotelian theory. Not necessarily this particular, stop sign, for example. Okay, great. Maybe real quick, we could just briefly. Again, we're we're inching closer to getting to your kind of arguments against the Aristotelian view. But your first argument, is makes important use of the idea of exemplification. So maybe we could just giving a little bit more background, we could just mention something about exemplification. So, the idea of exemplification, I guess, is just like, if I got a blue cup, then the cup exemplifies blueness.
Yeah, correct. So exemplification is just, as say, a technical word. There are others as well. There is instantiation, there is participation. Some people call it in a more Platonic fashion. It's just a technical word to indicate something that for a realist, I think, is quite unavoidable. So if you have a universal, say universal redness, and you also have red things, then of course they are not completely unrelated. There is some kind of way in which they are related to one another. You might say that one has the other, one characterizes the other, one instantiates, participates, exemplifies the other. So we might have hugely different theories about this phenomenon, but I hope that at least the phenomenon we want to explain is clear enough. So we are talking about that thing, the relation between a universal and the particulars that somehow have it or share it.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. So let's now shift a little bit. So right off the bat, you might be worried about the Aristotelian view, which is that it looks like you have a situation where an existential fact, in other words, a fact about let's say, a universal existing, it kind of looks like that fact is being grounded in a relational fact. In other words, the fact that a universal like redness exists, it seems like on the Aristotelian view, is being grounded in a relational fact that the universal redness is related to, let's say, one stop sign or another, or one hat or another. So anyway, could you just kind of talk a little bit about this idea that like someone might be worried already that we're about the Aristotelian view insofar as it sounds like we might be grounding an existential fact in a relational fact?
Yeah, right. So I think that this is maybe what is behind one of the two arguments that we're going to discuss, indeed. So the idea that the existence of something can be grounded in that very thing being related to something else. And yes, I definitely do feel the weirdness, and it motivates one of the arguments. So the idea is that if the existence of something is grounded in its being related to something else, in a relational fact involving the thing itself, then the thing itself should already exist in some way, right? So to have the relational fact in the first place. So you see how the universal, as we were saying before, seems to be involved in bringing itself about, in grounding its own existence. So yes, I definitely share, of course, your feeling. Yeah, yes.
This is reminding me, I feel like I've been to parties or like, where things get heady and someone says something like, it's like reality is ultimately relational. And part of you is like, that sounds fun, but something sounds off about that. It can't be relations at the very bottom. And I think, the sense is that, anyway, I think this is connected to that issue.
This thought that relations cannot be at the bottom of everything might help somehow see the motivation for rejecting the idea that indeed a relational fact might be the ultimate ground of the existence of something. But on top of this, I think that there is a specific problem here. So we are not simply saying that a relational fact grounds an existential fact, but we are saying that a relational fact involving the entity that is said to exist and to ground the existence of which is somehow involved in that relational fact. And I feel like this is even more problematic than the simple thought that an existence fact can be grounded in a relational fact.
Right. Yeah, and ultimately that specific aspect of the issue might be what makes one uneasy about the thought that relational facts would be at the very bottom, because it seems like at some point that's going to require a relational fact that involves, item A being ontologically responsible for, the existence of item A, something like that. At any rate, okay, yeah, that's a good distinction though to make there. Okay, cool. Yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about two arguments that you have. One against, they're both against Aristotelian universals. One kind of focuses on exemplification, the other one about a construction. And so maybe I'll just try to. My thought was like maybe. I'll try to give like a rough sense of how I understand the exemplification argument, and then you can kind of improve our understanding and all that kind of thing. So I'm just going to say, here seems to be the one like way of describing your exemplification argument. The existence of a universal for Aristotelians is supposed to be grounded in its being exemplified. And so, for example, if you have a red stop sign, that might be part of what grounds the existence of redness itself, the universal redness. But exemplification looks kind of like a genuine relation. So when a stop sign exemplifies redness, that seems like a relation between the stop sign and redness. But if exemplification is a relation, it seems that the relata, the things being related, need to exist prior to the relation. So, I mean, in a normal case, right? Like if there's a relation between me and Bob, I shake his hand. It seems like I need to exist prior to the shaking of hands. Bob needs to exist prior to the shaking of hands. So there's this basic idea that like, hey, prior to a relation, the relata, the things being related, exist. And so if exemplifications is a relation, then it seems like redness as well as this, the stop sign need to exist prior to the stop sign exemplifying redness. But if redness exists prior to the exemplification relation, then of course, the existence of redness can't be grounded in this instance of exemplification. Anyway, that's my. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long or confusing. But
yeah, no, I think that you characterized it well. Of course, we should always keep in mind that when talking about priority here, we are talking about metaphysical priority, right? That somehow the relata are the building blocks of relational facts. But yes, I think that the gist of the argument is the one that you have just described. So according to the Aristotelian view, the existence of universals is grounded in their being exemplified, but their being exemplified is basically to be exemplified by something, like, for example, redness by red stop. In this, of course, redness being exemplified by a red stop is a relational fact. So it seems that relational facts ground existential facts. But as you have pointed out, the second step is that relational facts seem to be in turn grounded by the existence of the relata. And the relata there are the stop sign, but redness. So it seems that if you put these two pieces of the puzzle, these two steps together, you get that the existence of redness is grounded ultimately on itself, which is, as we have mentioned before, something that seems to be, according to many people, is at odds with the very notion of grounding or dependence. Nothing can ground itself.
And good. So your argument, when you kind of put it in a rigorous way and you really outline all the premises and such, it makes use of, I think, 4 metaphysical principles. And so we could kind of run through these maybe quickly to just help the listener appreciate, the rigor of your argument, the argument in its full glory, so to speak. Okay. So, the first principle is the relata first principle. And I was kind of trying to gesture at this with the whole, prior to me shaking John's hand, you need to have first the existence of Sam Bennett. And then second, you need to have the existence of John. So there, the two things that are in relation through the shaking of hands, they exist prior to the shaking of hands. So roughly speaking, if there's a relation between X and Y must first exist. So that's one principle, one metaphysical principle you're using in this theory, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Indeed. I call it relata first for somehow obvious reasons, because it places metaphysical priority in the hands of the relata as opposed to the relational fact. And the idea is that really, if you have relational facts, they are not something fundamental. Rather, they are at least in part grounded in the existence of the relata. Yeah.
Okay, great. And and then, like I said, there's a couple other principles at play in your argument. Another one is the instance first principle. So this one might be a little bit harder to explain easily, but it's basically the idea is like, if you have an existential claim, like, there is, something that is red. Something is red. There's something that is red. That type of existential claim. Well, it's going to be grounded in a particular red object that we could hypothetically name. Maybe we call the red object Tommy. And so an existential fact like there exists something red is going to be grounded in there being a particular thing which we could name, such as Tommy being red.
Your reconstruction or your presentation of the principle of instances first is indeed correct. Maybe another entry point into it is, well, suppose you have these two facts. One is an existential fact. Let's say, for example, to give a different example from the one that you have just given, consider the fact that something is human. Okay? This is the first fact. And the second fact is Socrates is human. So an instance of the first one. You have these two facts. And the question might be, are they related by the relations of grounding? Is one prior to the other? In principle, they might not be related at all. Grounding might go both ways. But this instances first principle is one that tries to capture the intuition according to which the fact with the instance is more fundamental than the existential fact. So the fact that Socrates is human grounds the fact, the more generic fact that something is human. Okay, so it's one, I think you're right. It's one of the, you start seeing this sort of technicalities of the debate on grounding. It's not something new in philosophy, of course. Throughout the history of philosophy, when philosophers start talking, or a group of philosophers starts talking about something, then it gets very technical quite soon. This is the situation of the contemporary debate on grounding, I would say. But if you start entering into this debate and considering these questions, you probably see the plausibility of these principles. And probably the other principles that I'm going to mention are in the same family as well. Yeah.
To move on to the other two, so the other one has to do with transitivity of grounding. So very straightforward. So it's like, let's say something is scarlet. Okay, that's its color. Maybe you want to say it being scarlet is grounded in it being red. Oh, sorry. No, maybe we go the other way. If something's red, you might want to say that's grounded in having a very specific redness, which is it being scarlet. And then you might want to say, well, it being scarlet is grounded in, some very specific wavelength. And so by transitivity of grounding, then you're going to say, well, X being red is grounded in the object displaying a very specific wavelength. And so anyway, if A is grounded in B and B is grounded in C, then A is grounded in C is like kind of the idea, basically.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. Or to give a different example, you might think that, for example, my existence is grounded in the existence and arrangement of my parts. And let's say, for example, the society in which I live, the existence of that society is grounded in my existence or my being related to other human beings. Well, in that case, transitivity tells us that also the existence of the society is grounded in whatever grounds my existence. Yes, perfect. So this is the transitivity of grounding.
Yeah. Right, and then the irreflexivity of grounding, that's the final fourth metaphysical principle that you use in your argument. And that one is what we've already been talking about. It's just how there can't be a circle back where something grounds itself. That would be like a reflexive grounding. And so irreflexivity is just saying, no, there cannot be that kind of reflexive grounding of itself.
Yeah, correct. So no fact can ground itself. Indeed, so the principles that you have just mentioned are supposed to, some of them are more popular, some of them are less popular, but they are all supposed to be principles that capture the nature of grounding or metaphysical priority or dependence. And by telling us how this relation behaves, they are supposed to tell us something about what it is, what is the nature of this relation of dependence. Yeah. And if you put all these premises together, you end up with the Aristotelian view to the conclusion that the existence of a universal grounds itself, which is contrary, of course, to the reflexivity of grounding, and therefore you should find a premise to be rejected and eventually suggest the Aristotelian view should be rejected.
So now let's talk a little bit about objections that have come up, and then that can lead us into your second argument for it. Do you want to just talk about, what do you think are just some potential objections to your argument?
Right. So I think that, at least in principle, also in the original argument, they consider several possible objections, but I think that in principle, there are many possible objections that are possible. I mean, there are many possible objections against this argument. And this maybe is one of the reasons why I like this argument, because, of course, it's a bit my creature, so I'm a bit partial, but my feeling is that this argument constitutes a sort of entry point to many fundamental questions of metaphysics. And one of those questions is really whether exemplification is really a relation, right? And the argument, as we have just presented, relies on this idea that exemplification really is a relation. And there is a huge discussion about this. Is it really a relation? On the one hand, I feel like it seems difficult to deny this. If one is a realist, then really you have two entities there. You have universal redness and you have the red thing. So somehow they should be linked or tied. It doesn't really matter how you want to call it, but there should be something like a relation there. And so there should be a fact that is somehow a relational fact. But on the other hand, many realists or non-realists or nominalists think that there are good reasons to reject this. So, for example, there are various similar arguments like Bradley's regress or Ryle's regress, or Armstrong have also presented some arguments against this idea. So if exemplification is a relation, then you might end up in some regress, which is supposed to be vicious. Now, like almost all philosophical arguments, there are replies here, and the debate is huge there. I personally tend to be persuaded by the first reaction. If you are a realist, you have really two entities. You need some kind of relation there. If it is not a relation, it's unclear what it might be. Some people talk about a non-relational tie, but a tie is just a relation of some sort. Some people talk of universals having slots. Or universals being unsaturated or incomplete. But I feel like these attempts fall under what Aristotle used to call empty metaphors by talking about participation. Maybe it's a little bit strong what I said, because I take those attempts really seriously. It's just a way of saying that I feel like saying that exemplification is a relation is the most obvious choice there. In the paper, I say that even if exemplification is not a relation, it's something else, then I feel like a principle of a different letter but of a similar spirit to relata first would apply. So you would not have a relational fact because you don't have a relation, but you have a fact concerning the tie. And I would feel like a principle that is similar to relata first would apply. In order to have a fact about a tie between two things, you need the two things in the first place. So denying that exemplification is a relation, I don't think is going to solve the problem completely.
Great. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and it would be nice to kind of go a little bit into the Bradley style worries about regress. I guess that's kind of motivating, or that could be used to motivate the rejection of saying exemplification is a relation. Because I don't know, I guess to me, it seems like we should, be initially inclined to say exemplification is a relation, just in sort of in virtue of like the linguistic form of the statement. If you say the stop sign is exemplifying redness, it kind of just seems like that's a relation. But yeah, basically, if we had more time, it would be nice to go into those kind of Bradley style worries about regress. Anyway, yeah. So we'll just kind of leave that aside, flag that for the listener. So you kind of mentioned how, there's a way of approaching this argument where, you drop the insistence that exemplification is a relation. Is this kind of gesturing to a second argument that you've developed that, this kind of like we might call like a construction argument?
Yeah, that's correct. So in my original paper, as a kind of response, ultimate response to the question of whether exemplification is a relation, whether this could block the argument, I point out that the same job that is done in the argument by the relata first principle could also be done by another principle. That is the idea that if you have facts on the one end and their constituents on the other, so whatever makes up or is involved in the fact, then the constituents are supposed to be more fundamental than the fact. So this is a principle that is maybe close to an Aristotelian outlook of reality, right? So, for example, substances or other components of facts are supposed to be more fundamental than facts. Maybe to situate this principle in a broader metaphysical perspective, you might see this at odds with a different perspective according to which facts are the basic building blocks of reality. And say objects or properties are abstractions out of these basic building blocks. So you might think that the word is a word of states of affairs or facts. And this would be the idea. And if you have other things, these are just secondary things in the order of the metaphysical hierarchy of reality. So if you adopt the first approach and you think that constituents are always more fundamental than facts, then you have basically a different way to get to the same conclusion, to the conclusion of rejecting the Aristotelian view. Because, the idea is that in any case you have the Aristotelian view is the view according to which universals or the existence of the universes is grounded in their being exemplified. So, for example, redness on it's being exemplified by this apple, say. You might think that this is not a relational fact. You might account for this in some other way, but still, it is a fact that involves as a constituent the universal itself. So the apple is red.
Especially if you're already a realist, right, which the Aristotelian is. I mean, you kind of gestured at this earlier. If you say, the fact doesn't involve a universal, it seems like, well, then you're just going to end up exiting the realist.
Correct. So, of course, this is supposed to be an argument against the Aristotelian view, so a realist view. So the question is, if you're a realist, can you really say that the apple is red is not a fact that involves universal redness? In principle, you could, but it's not so straightforward how you can do that. So again, discussing about this opens lots of further discussions about what the nature of the fact the apple is red might be, right? Indeed, you might think that somehow this has to do with the appearance of redness, but of course it would introduce a sort of perspectival aspect that is probably absent from the intuition of the Aristotelian. Another philosopher might think that maybe the existence of the universal is grounded in, and the fact that the apple is red involves rather what we have been calling before individual accidents. So what nowadays would be called tropes. So this would be a different way of cashing out the Aristotelian view. And the question is there whether this actually solves the argument that I've just presented. I'm not totally sure about this because, and this I think I'm not even sure, but I think that I've written it in one of the responses that I've published on, the article has generated some debates. But the point is that not any trope would do. You need a red trope in order to ground the existence of redness. And what is it for a red trope to be a red trope? Probably it has to do with its relation to universal redness. And so it's not so obvious that this would actually solve the problem completely, or this would properly characterize the Aristotelian view. Yeah. But yes, I mean, in principle, you might work in that direction of trying to understand a fact like the apple is red in a different way, not involving the universal.
But yeah, so one objection that was raised against the kind of like construction version of the argument that I thought was interesting was this guy Nathan Wildman, philosopher Nathan Wildman, he said something like, well, if you say that the constituents, always precede the state of affairs, well, like one state of affairs is Tommy exists, but if the constituents need to precede that state of affairs, then it seems like preceding Tommy exists is Tommy existing. So anyway, I don't know. He was trying to say I don't want to misrepresent it, but yeah, something like that. Actually, this constituents first type principle kind of generates some bizarre outcomes, regardless of whether you're an Aristotelian, something like that.
Yeah, correct. Maybe what you just said made me think about the fact that I should also mention that while my first paper, the version of the argument there, was really based on relata first, and I only mentioned this other version of the argument as a reply to a possible objection, there is another paper by Mike Raven that is somehow in the same ballpark, is also presenting an argument against Aristotelian universals. That is basically the second argument that we have mentioned, that is really focused on this construction version of the argument. And so Nathan Wildman is really responding to the two of us simultaneously. And I think that is really, it's really interesting. And it's a good point that needs to be, I think, properly addressed. And the point is roughly the one, if I got that right, the one that you mentioned. So the question is, suppose that you take seriously this idea of construction. So the idea is that constituents of facts are more fundamental than the facts themselves. This, what I've called this kind of Aristotelian intuition. Constituents are more fundamental than facts. Well, can this be true in general? And Nathan came up with a possible counterexample. Consider the fact that, again, Tommy exists. This seems to be a fact. What are the constituents of those facts? Well, at least one constituent is Tommy. And so this principle of construction would entail that Tommy exists is grounded in Tommy exists, in the existence of one of each of these constituents. So this would, again, by irreflexivity, would be an argument against this construction principle. So the idea that constituents are more fundamental than facts. So I think it's a good point that needs to be properly addressed. My feeling is that construction, so this principle that constituents are more fundamental than facts, only suggests that the existence of constituents is a sort of natural stopping point of metaphysical explanation. So I feel like the spirit of the principle probably vindicates a formulation that restricts the principle to cases that are not existence facts. So you have a fact. In case it is not an existence fact, then this fact is grounded in the existence of the constituents. But if it is an existence fact, you have already reached what the principle tells you should be the bottom of this chain of grounding facts. So this is, I would reply.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So it's like maybe this principle of constituents being more fundamental than the fact, maybe it only applies when the fact has a sort of subject property type structure, and maybe Tommy exists doesn't have that structure. And anyway, point being is that maybe there's a way of articulating the principle so that it doesn't range over existence facts, because it looks like the Wildman type objection is sort of depending, or it's generating a counterexample from specifically existential facts. So if there was a way of articulating the constituency principle so that it's not including those types of facts, then maybe that would be one way of responding.
Yeah, correct. And once again, it's not simply a response to my argument or Raven's argument. It's really a topic in its own right. It's the topic of let's say, the question of whether facts are fundamental entities or are somehow grounded in their constituents, which I think has an independent interest and historical pedigree.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Damiano. I mean, it's really been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate you kind of walking us through this, fascinating line of argument that you've developed. Just for the listeners, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about, in terms of what you're working on now, or maybe some other articles you'd want to highlight that listeners might find interesting?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, I work mainly in metaphysics and a little bit in philosophy of physics. Nowadays I'm working on this topic too. I'm basically investigating or mapping the various directions that this discussion can take, and eventually at some point I will probably write a new paper with some responses to objections like the one by Nathan Wildman. On top of this, I'm also working on philosophy of physics. So more specifically, I'm working on the concept of space-time. I don't know how much your listeners might be fascinated by this topic, but the basic point being, we always, all of us talk freely about space-time, not space and time, but space-time as a single thing. And this talk seems to be somehow justified by contemporary physics and especially relativity theory. But the question is, what is really space-time? What does it take to abandon a traditional view according to which there is space and there is time, and accept one according to which there is space-time? And I feel like there is much work to be done there. There is a paper that I published back in 2016 in Philosophy Compass, Relativity and Three Four-Dimensionalisms, together with two colleagues. And this is a sort of explanation of the consequence for our view of reality on the basis of relativity theory. And we also deal with this question of space-time, but I feel that there is much work to be done there, and I'm working on this right now.
Wonderful. That sounds fascinating. So again, Damiano, thank you so much for coming on. And to all the listeners, I highly recommend check out his article, An Argument Against Aristotelian Universals. Thanks again.
Many thanks, Sam. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.